Hi, thanks for listening. This episode is titled Maydays, but in fact, this is an episode about domestic abuse while on lockdown during the COVID-19 pandemic. We apologize if you came here thinking it was something else. The episode is the same as another in our feed today titled Domestic Violence, Isolation, and What to Do If You or Someone You Know is at Risk. We released this version with an alternative title so people who are isolated with potential abusers would be more comfortable playing this episode, displaying the title for 20 minutes on their device while living with potentially snooping eyes. Or if not you, but you know someone in danger, you might feel more comfortable sending them this version than the one with domestic abuse in the title. Or if listening to this is still too risky, the stars Wendy Gillis and Alicia Hasham have put a resource guide together at thestar.com/pleasehelp. Please take care of each other and yourselves. From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. We have been told staying home is the only way to protect ourselves from the virus, but for many, home is not safe. And if any of you listening to me are locked in with an abuser, or if you're worried about someone you know, you can get help. If you're in immediate danger, call 911. And police stations are still open for walk-ins. A lot of local shelters are also open. You can get to safety. Please know, you're not alone. Help is out there. Domestic abusers are no longer walking among us. They are locked inside with their families. As the world battles a global emergency, another one simmers just below the surface. A crisis the UN is calling the shadow pandemic.
For many women and girls, the threat looms largest where they should be safest, in their own homes. And so I make a new appeal today for peace at home and in homes around the world.
The distress signals are coming from countries around the world wherever the virus looms and lockdown measures follow. The numbers in domestic violence spike along with it.
In a report published today, the Home Affairs Select Committee warns that, like other countries across the world, the UK is seeing a rise in domestic violence, with calls to the abuse charity helpline run by Refuge up by 49%.
Here, Canada's Minister for Women and Gender Equality, Mariam Munsef, told CBC News that there's been a 20 to 30% increase in incidents of gender-based violence.
She's being asked to stay home. And his most powerful tool, isolation, is now endorsed by the state.
Calls to shelters in some places have multiplied by 400%, while in others it's dropped dramatically. A scary silence, because women might have fewer opportunities to escape. That could lead to worse.
We're learning exclusive new details about these devastating shootings in Nova Scotia. The gunman's 13-hour-long killing spree began with domestic violence.
Today, I talked to Andrea Gunraj, Vice President of Public Engagement at the Canadian Women's Foundation and best-selling author, about why this is happening and how we can make it stop. Thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with this pandemic. We're seeing, ever since this pandemic and the measures began, a spike in numbers of domestic violence or abuse cases. We've seen increases in countries like China, the US, UK, and now we're seeing these numbers coming out in Canada. What's going on here?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. It's interesting because in the same time that we are seeing some spikes, some women's services and support services are saying that women are calling more frequently. Some places have also had a conspicuous decrease of calls and requests for help, and both are concerning, I think. I think it indicates that not only perhaps is violence actually increasing in homes, but people might be less able to access help and call for help because they're at risk of violence or they're stuck with their abuser in social isolation. So I think this kind of isolation that we're doing actually really sadly traps people in abusive relationships with their abusers and makes them more monitorable, honestly, by their abusers. So I think that we are seeing this spike of domestic violence, gender-based violence at large, but it's not particularly surprising given that other situations of outbreaks and disasters in the past all around the world have shown that these moments do increase that violence. I think there's a couple of things that might be going on. I think that we, first of all, have to acknowledge that there's a baseline of violence in Canada, that it's too high in the first place. It's very unacceptable. We see that every 6 days in Canada, on average, a woman is killed by her intimate partner. And I think that baseline is already there. And I think that the pandemic created creates a trigger for this violence to increase. But there's always been that baseline kind of high rate. And it really goes back to things like controlling behaviors, possessive jealousy, misogyny, the idea that this violence is somehow acceptable, that people are silent about it and not doing something about it and prioritizing changing it. I think there's a cultural, there's a social element to this, and we're just seeing the pandemic create these triggers that are making it go up. But it doesn't mean that it's something that's the virus's fault per se.
You mentioned triggers and the fact that since this pandemic, we're in a state of lockdown and self-isolation. How are all of those factors, and what are some of those factors that are combining to make victims of domestic violence even more vulnerable right now? What could be amplifying the situation?
Well, I think the Center for Global Development has really given us great insight about what are the stressors that lead to increased violence against women. They talk about things like job losses and reduced income creating stress, food insecurity, fears even about contracting the virus and being exposed. That stuff only worsens things like mental health issues, might worsen things like addictions, might make people more in a situation of tension, having their schedule impacted, having more pressures on them perhaps for caregiving children and elders. So all these things absolutely are stressors that we see are happening right now to many of us in this pandemic. And when many of us are either stuck at home or really afraid and having to be essential services and go and work, I think both groups of people are going to feel the stress. But I think, again, it's important for us to not look at it like it's inevitable, that the violence has to happen inevitably. Many of us experience the stress and don't behave violently to our partners and to our family members. So I think that kind of idea that the risk factors were there before. And as I mentioned, it's controlling behaviors and existing abuse and jealousy and anti-women attitudes or attitudes that I'm better than you or I need to discipline and harm somebody to get them to listen to me. I think that we have to remember that those things play out all the time, play out too much. And that the stresses on top of that, of course, will then make it so that those things combine into a perfect storm of more violence.
And you also spoke about victims currently being trapped in homes with their abusers and the likelihood that they could potentially be deterred from seeking help. So what can they do to protect themselves? What is your advice right now to those who might be trapped in this situation about how to handle this if they can't immediately access help?
There's a few things to point out here. I think it's really important to remember that many of the services and supports out there for people experiencing abuse, women included, elders included, children included, they're still open and they're still operational. They may look different right now. There may be some digitization that's happening. Things might be happening over the phone or by text. But many of these services are still fully functioning and trying their best to meet this need. So I really feel it's so important for people to remember that not everything is closed down and they can still access those supports. And I think this is so important for us to remember to keep telling people and just making it known. I do personally worry that sometimes abusers might say, well, you can go and try to find help, but everywhere's closed and you're not going to get anywhere and nobody's going to help you. That could be something that's quite recent, that line of thinking that you can try, but nobody's going to help you. So I think it's really important for us to remember that these services are there. Doesn't mean that the services are not stretched. Doesn't mean that they're not struggling to meet needs, but they are still there. And the second thing that I would also want to say, putting it on somebody who's being abused and who's suffering in this way. I think it's important that we don't put the responsibility and onus on that person alone. We have to remember that in any situation, pandemic or not, this violence is very difficult to escape. This violence feels overwhelming. Sometimes you are told, you're gaslit, you are trained to think that you have no other choices. So I think it's really quite wrong for us to look at the people being abused and saying it's up to you. You need to find help. You need to seek it out. I think what would be so beautiful and so important for us in our communities, for all of us to be that safe person that knows the services out there, knows this violence happens, puts it out there that we're not going to get shocked if somebody came to us and asked us for help. Put it out there that we're not going to blame you for asking for help, or we're not going to blame you for the abuse you're facing, that we'll believe you. I think there's no substitute, honestly, for being a safe person and for really being open and vocal about this with your friends, your family, your coworkers, your own sphere of influence, to basically be like, I know this stuff happens. It's more common than we'd like it to be. I want you to know that I'm here for you, and I'm a safe person, and I'm not going to charge ahead and try to solve it for you. I'm going to work alongside you. I'm going to take your lead. I won't be shocked. I won't blame you. I won't tell on you or anything like that. So really, I always look back at the folks around somebody who's experiencing violence and wondering if they can do more and if they can step up right now.
You mentioned a lot of victims who are trapped with their abusers might not be feeling quite as confident, might be under a lot of pressure and fear or being gaslit. So tactically and psychologically, how can they fortify themselves first on an individual level?
Oftentimes people need to hear an outside perspective to get perspective on what they're going through in their own lives. The thing about abuse, and I believe all abuse has an emotional abuse element to it, regardless of whether it's physical abuse or, other kinds of abuse that people might face, there's always an emotional element and a mental element. So a lot of the times you might kind of just get into this place where you're just got this one perspective and this person is harming you and making you feel like you can't go for help. So I think one of the things that can be very helpful is calling a crisis line that knows what this abuse looks like and feels like. I think the Assaulted Women's Helpline is a really great place to call. And what's so good about them is that they have services available in 150 different languages. They're 24/7. There's lots of ways of reaching out to them. And just to get that outside perspective can really make a positive difference to say, okay, I think I'm going crazy here. Can you tell me what you think? Is this what I think it is? So that's like such a valuable thing, I would say. And not just the Assaulted Women's Helpline, but frankly, there's lots of services that deal with gender-based violence and domestic violence and any kind of family violence, things like Family Services Toronto here in Toronto. And there's lots of family services or organizations and associations all over the country. There's services like shelters and sexual assault centers that have crisis and call lines. I would just encourage people to reach out to those places. And, what's good about it is that you don't have to have a plan and you don't have to feel like I have to leave to get support. I have to leave my abusive partner, for instance, to get support. I think it's really important to recognize that sometimes folks can't leave. Sometimes even if you might think about leaving, it might take you several tries and several years even to think it through and figure it out. Maybe it's just not a possibility. Maybe you don't want to leave. Maybe you just want the violence to stop. All that is totally fine. And you don't have to have a prerequisite of what you're going to do before you reach out to these services. They're not going to blame you. In fact, they fully understand all the limitations and barriers somebody may face. So that's just one of the things that I think of right away in terms of what we can do to make sure that people who are survivors of this violence are supported.
Your organization also launched a campaign recently called Signal for Help. Can you tell us more about that and how does that work exactly?
Yeah, definitely. The Signal for Help campaign is something very simple that we launched just a week ago, and it's a social isolation signal that somebody can use when they're stuck at home with an abusive person and they need to indicate that they need somebody to check in with them, but they don't want to leave a digital trace. It's really good for video calls, obviously, where somebody can see you. And it's basically just a palm up to the screen, tucking in your thumb, and then trapping your thumb with your other fingers, just that move. And that is something that we wanted to share with folks as an opportunity for those of us who are seeing this violence play out or maybe seeing somebody on a call who tells us they need help. And that's also for the person who's experiencing this violence to indicate, I need somebody to check in with me. I think it's really important to mention that, of course, it's only going to be helpful to somebody if they are on a video call. And I know that there are access issues with video calls. Maybe people don't have that. There's, of course, a digital divide that people may not have, a cell phone or may not have a computer to be able to do that. So that given. There are, of course, other ways that people can reach out for help. This is just one tool that might help some people some of the time. But we were aware that video calling is becoming more and more common. People are using FaceTiming and using Zoom a lot, for instance. So this is just a simple campaign and a simple tool. And I think more than anything, it's just one of these campaigns that whether or not people actually use the signal for help is a valuable campaign because it puts it in the forefront of those of us who might see somebody needs help. It puts it in our mind that we have to do something. And it puts us in our mind that we have, a role to play in ending this violence. So I would just mention that it's one of these things that somebody can show that they need the help and they need somebody to check in with them. So it's really important for the person who sees it to reach out to them safely. And that could be calling them and asking them yes or no questions. That could be reaching out to them through WhatsApp or email and just saying, hey, when you feel safe, give me a shout. So yeah, that's the long and the short of it. And people can go to CanadianWomen.org if they want more details and more resources of what they can do to support somebody who uses a signal.
This is actually reminding me of a campaign currently in France where victims can go to a drugstore and say the code word mask 19 if they need help, but they can't say it openly. Aside from this campaign that you launched, is there something similar in Canada, a sort of distress code language for victims and even for us to show them that we are here to help?
Well, there are so many different campaigns going on, and I'm not even fully aware of them. There's quite a number, and I think, as you mentioned, they're going on in Canada and going on around the world. I only know of the Signal for Help in Canada right now, but I know that there are a lot of different things that people can use. I've seen campaigns around the dot on your palm, putting a dot on your palm and saying that you need help. I've seen people with like a pin on their lapel. I've seen that going on. I don't know if that's the States or Canada. And again, I think it's one of these things where anybody could say this could create some risk for somebody, and they may not be safe in using it. So I think it's important to recognize that there's no better thing to do than to just be that safe person so that somebody can reach out to you however they can, whatever is safe for them. If it's not going to be the Signal for Help, if it's not going to be a clothespin on their collar, it might be other things. And we just have to be available. And I think it's really important for people who are doing the abusing to know that there are lots of safe people out there who want to do something and that this is top of mind for many of us, just like washing our hands and making sure that we social distance is top of mind right now, that we will not accept violence in our communities. It has to be top of mind right now as well, too.
And you're talking about safe people, which is exactly what I wanted to ask you. How can they help when they see a situation like this? Clearly, this is not a time to sort of inculcate a mind your own business philosophy. So what can they do if they see a situation like this or if they see somebody is struggling or trying to reach out to help?
Well, I think you've definitely started it right by thinking about a mind your own business mentality. Unfortunately, too much of this violence has been mind your own business. So I think the first thing I would ever tell anybody who wants to be an ally and a safe person is to challenge yourself on any kind of moment when you feel like maybe I shouldn't step in, maybe it's just between him or her. I think it's important for us to start with our attitudes around that and our tendencies. And I wouldn't blame anybody for feeling that way. Sometimes I've been trapped up with that kind of idea. Maybe I shouldn't say anything or do anything because I'm worried about the person's safety. And I'm also not particularly feeling equipped to do something. That's the first thing. Second thing, though, that I think that we can do is be proactive with the people that we know in our lives who might be in a dangerous situation. I think this is true for most of us. Most of us do know somebody who we worry about, and we think perhaps they could get in a dangerous situation or they could be abused, but we've never said anything to them and we've kind of just held it to ourselves. I think it's important for us to actually put it out there to our friends and family, and that might just very well be doing a Zoom call with our friends and family. That could be reaching out by email and saying, hey, I know that domestic violence is increasing, and I just want to let you know that there's this campaign and there's these places that you can go. So become that kind of person who recognizes these things and actually is known to be the person who is good to help. The third thing I would say is to make sure that everything we do is survivor-led and very careful, because we know, again, there's risks associated with this. Somebody could feel like they're at a greater risk of violence when they're seeking help. So I think it's important for us to be really mindful, to just speak about things in a safe way with people. And that means, as again, I mentioned to you, doing calls with people and asking them questions, yes or no, so that they don't have to go into it in big detail if they need to tell you that they need help. I think it also means taking the lead from survivors and people who are dealing with this violence, not telling them, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to solve this for you, I'm going to call the police for you. That's not helpful and that's not safe. And that person may not want to go down that route right now. They just might not be ready and they might not be safe. And I think that the people who are experiencing this violence are really experts on how to address this violence in their lives. Sadly, they have to be experts to survive. So just take the lead from those who need help. Don't take over for them. Don't do things that might put them in a more difficult situation. And just know the services that are available in your community that you can refer people to.
And earlier in the interview, Andrea, you said the virus is technically not to blame. It's only highlighted a terrible issue, which is something we as a community need to confront and end, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't want to underplay the importance of the virus. And I don't want to underplay the risks and the fears that people are facing right now, for sure. But I think it is just too obvious that gender-based violence, domestic violence, elder abuse, child abuse is just far too common, period. It was this way always before the pandemic. And that we see a spike right now is something to be really concerned about and to want to do something about. But I think it's really important that we don't look to the pandemic or look to the virus and say, that is the cause. We have a deeper cause here that we have to address. And I just don't want us to get distracted from those deeper issues, nor think that the kinds of solutions are going to be like just as long as the social isolation happens or the investments is only kind of a one-time thing. I think it's longer solutions, longer-term solutions, and deeper investment than we've ever really dedicated in Canada.
Andrea, you've been so very insightful. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
That was Andrea Gunraj, Vice President Public Engagement at the Canadian Women's Foundation. And like we spoke about, this is not the time to mind our own business, but to keep our eyes and ears open so we can help those who might be trapped and in peril because of the lockdown. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our Director of Programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by SoCalled, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.